The recruiter had answered 1,000 calls exactly like this one, and he already knew, before the conversation was finished, that this one would end the same way the others had ended. The voice on the line said it wanted to become a Navy SEAL. They all said that. They said it with the specific kind of conviction that sounded completely real, because in the moment it was completely real. In that room, holding that phone, feeling the feeling that had prompted the call, the conviction was genuine and total. The recruiter understood that. He had nothing against the conviction. What he had learned, through years of answering these calls and then waiting for a second call that never arrived, was that the conviction in the moment and the follow-through across months of genuine pain were two different things that lived in different parts of a person, and most callers had found only the first. He asked a few standard questions. He asked about weight. The voice gave him a number. 297 pounds. The recruiter noted this, gave the man a timeline and the specific weight threshold required for enlistment, thanked him, and set the phone down. He made a note in his log. He moved to the next item. He did not think about the call again. There was no reason to. He had delivered that same information to many men who were over the limit, and they had thanked him and hung up, and that had been the end of it. Because the gap between 297 pounds and the enlistment threshold was not the kind of gap that people crossed. It was the kind of gap people stood at the edge of, looked down into, and then quietly backed away from, because crossing it required something that most people could not locate inside themselves, when the initial feeling that had prompted the call had faded back into the ordinary texture of a regular day. The man who had made the call was David Goggins. He was 24 years old. He drove a truck that needed work. He killed insects for a living, spraying chemicals in the dark, narrow spaces of other people's homes, the work of a man who had made himself invisible by profession. He ate too much, moved too little, and spent his evenings on a couch telling himself in the vague and non-committal way of someone who has postponed the same decision so many times that postponing has become a habit rather than a choice, that things would be different someday. He set the phone down. He held the silence for a moment. He began. What it means that he began, what the beginning actually required and contained and cost, is not something that can be conveyed in the language of transformation stories, which tend to be written for comfort. The language of transformation is gentle by design. It softens edges, provides context, tells you that the difficult period was finite, and that it was worth it in terms that make the difficulty sound more like a temporary inconvenience than a prolonged confrontation with every part of yourself that has learned to stop when the signal arrives. David Goggins' beginning was not gentle. He lost 106 pounds in under 3 months. There is no sentence that fully transmits what that requires. The body does not surrender 106 pounds willingly. It fights. Every single day of those 3 months was a confrontation between what the body demanded and what the decision required, and the decision had to win every day, not most days, not the days when the feeling of motivation was present and available, but every day, including the days when motivation was entirely absent, and the only thing present was the original decision, which had to be sufficient to carry those days, because nothing else was available to do it. He ran when his joints were protesting sharply enough to be impossible to ignore. He trained with weights on a caloric intake that made those weights heavier than they would otherwise have been. He did all of this consistently, in private, without an audience, without the social reinforcement that most transformation stories include as a structural element. He was alone with the decision. He made it enough. He showed up at the recruiter's office at the required weight, and the training began. But to understand what came after the training, the records, the world record, the bar, the counting, the foam pads from the mattress company, the attic in Poland, all of it, you need to understand what Goggins was made of before any of that began. You need to understand where the couch was, and what the couch represented, and what a person is carrying when they sit on it. He was born on the 17th of February, 1975, in the eastern part of New York State. His childhood was not the kind that a person looks back on with warmth. His father was not a man who modeled anything that a son would want to carry forward. The household was not stable in the ways that matter most when you are young. Not emotionally stable, not physically safe in the deepest sense. Not the kind of environment that gives a child the feeling that the world is fundamentally navigable and that they have the resources to navigate it. What an early life like that deposits in a person is not usually visible on the outside. It shows up in other ways. In the speed at which a person lowers their eyes when someone looks at them with expectation. In the way they fill space, or more precisely, the way they learn not to fill it, to make themselves smaller than they are, to occupy as little as possible, so that as little as possible can be taken from them or used against them. In the particular fluency they develop with avoidance, which is the primary survival skill of an environment that regularly punishes presence. He learned to cheat through school, not impulsively but as a system for continuing to move forward without having to face what he did not understand, what he was falling behind on, what was accumulating into a deficit that would eventually become visible if he stopped and looked at it. He passed things he should not have passed. He moved through grades without the actual content of those grades, which meant he arrived at the end of school with a diploma that documented a fiction and with skills that did not match what the diploma implied. He found work. The work was the exterminating, the chemicals and the dark spaces and the invisibility of it. He was not there as a person with ambitions who had found himself temporarily in this job. He was there as the logical conclusion of years of following the path of least resistance, with no intervening force to redirect him. The job asked nothing, except the completion of its mechanical tasks. It expected nothing. It produced, at the end of each day, an evening on the couch, and the vague, formless sense that time was passing, and nothing particular was happening in it. The night that changed this was not dramatic in the way the word dramatic usually implies. There was no crisis, no rock bottom in the traditional sense, no emergency that forced a reckoning. There was just a man on a couch and a television program, and a feeling that arrived in his chest without announcement, and refused to leave quietly. The program was about the Navy SEALs, documentary footage, men in BUD/S training, basic underwater demolition and SEAL, the entry process for the most selective military force in the country. The footage showed men in the surf at 3 in the morning, wet and cold and exhausted, being required to do things that had long since exceeded what the body found reasonable. Most of them quit. The footage documented that clearly, without editorial comment. The quitting was not presented as failure in any particular moral sense. It was presented as information, as the moment when a person discovered where their limit was. The ones who did not quit were the ones Goggins could not stop watching. They were not visibly different from the others, not larger, not more obviously built for what they were doing. They simply had not stopped. They were still doing the thing when the others had decided to stop doing it, and the only explanation available was that they had made a decision somewhere along the way that the signal the body was sending when it wanted to quit was not the final word on the subject. Goggins felt something arrive in his chest while watching them. The thing that does not have a clean name, not admiration precisely, because admiration implies a comfortable distance from the thing being admired, and this feeling was not distant, it was close. It felt like recognition of something he had always contained but had never accessed, a room inside himself that he had walked past every day without opening the door. He picked up the phone the next morning. He called the recruiter. The rest of that conversation has already been told. What followed was the 106 pounds in under 3 months, and then BUD, which he began with the specific preparation of someone who has already made the decision that will carry him through. The program found most candidates' limits and ended their time there. It did not find his. He graduated with Class 235 in 2001 and received his Trident. He then kept going, which was the part that distinguished him, not just from people who never became SEALs, but from many people who did. He graduated from Army Ranger School. He received the Enlisted Honor Man Award for his class, given on the basis of a 100% peer evaluation from the people who had trained beside him. He served in Iraq. He watched friends die in Afghanistan in a helicopter crash during Operation Red Wings in 2005, and he channeled the grief in the only language he had for grief, movement. He ran ultramarathons. He fundraised for the families of the dead. He completed events of 100 miles and beyond, on a training schedule that professional athletes would have found difficult to look at. All Hands magazine called him the toughest man alive. He wrote a book that sold millions of copies and explained, in accessible and unflinching terms, the central principle that had governed his life since the night on the couch. He called it the 40% rule. When the body signals that it is done, when the feeling of total spentness arrives, when everything says stop, A person has used roughly 40% of their actual capacity. The remaining 60% is behind a wall. The wall is real. So is what is behind it. Getting through it requires only that a person decline to accept the first signal as the last word. He had been testing this rule since the couch. He had been finding it accurate every time. And now, at 36 years old, temporarily unable to run, due to a health issue that his doctors connected to the cumulative effects of years of extreme physical effort, he had picked up a different kind of challenge. He was already doing pull-ups. One afternoon he counted them seriously. The number was interesting. He looked up what the world record was. 4,020 pull-ups in 24 hours, set by a British man named Stephen Hyland in 2011. He looked at the number. He thought about the 40% rule. He put his hands on the bar. He trained for 6 months. In those 6 months, in private, he performed 40,000 pull-ups as preparation, not as the record itself, as the foundation from which the record would become possible. He developed the specific endurance that a 24-hour pull-up attempt required, which was different from general pull-up strength, the way that an ocean swimmer's conditioning is different from a sprint swimmer's. He developed the capacity to sustain pace across hours, to manage the deterioration of the hands that extended pull-up sessions produced, to fuel the effort across a full day in a way that did not produce the crashes that poor nutritional timing created in long endurance events. He arranged to attempt the record on NBC's Today Show in New York City, September 27, 2012. He walked into the studio that morning and understood immediately that something was wrong. The studio was blazing with commercial television lighting. There were cameras and hosts and producers and people on the other side of the glass window who had stopped to watch. The environment was the opposite of the private, focused spaces where he had always done his best work. And the bar had give. He felt it when he gripped it for the first time. The bar flexed under load, subtly but measurably, in a way that demanded a compensatory tightening of the grip to maintain stability. Over thousands of repetitions, that compensatory tightening would become a catastrophic cumulative drain. He kept going anyway. He went to 2,588 pull-ups in 5.5 hours before his forearm tore. Partial tear. The kind of signal the body sends that is not a negotiation, but an announcement of structural failure. He stopped. He thanked the hosts. He left the studio. He was already making the list of what needed to change. He fixed everything on the list. He found a gym in Nashville with a rigid bar and a semi-private environment. He drove there on November 27, 2012. His hands lasted 10 hours before the gloves came off with the skin. He got 3,207 pull-ups before the pace dropped below what the remaining time required to reach 4,020. He stopped. 2 failures. 2 enormous efforts. Nothing to show for either of them except a very precise understanding of what had gone wrong and what needed to be different. He contacted a mattress manufacturer about custom foam pads for his hands. Guinness approved them. He booked the 3rd attempt for January 20, 2013. He walked into CrossFit Brentwood Hills in Nashville on a January morning, with the foam pads on his hands, and the specific quality of a man who has already decided what will happen and has come to do it. He pulled for 17 hours, 4,030 pull-ups. 10 more than Hyland, done with 7 hours remaining on the clock. Between the 6 months of training and 3 attempts, he had performed more than 67,000 pull-ups to produce 4,030 when the moment required them. The record was certified. The proof was complete. The proof began to travel. It moved through the fitness community and then beyond it. It moved through the internet and the social networks and the specific channels through which extraordinary physical achievement finds its audience. It moved through the words of a book called Can't Hurt Me, and the footage of a gym in Nashville, and the specific and transmissible idea that the 40% rule was not a metaphor, but a structural fact about human capacity. It moved toward Poland. It moved toward an attic. It was moving toward the next person who would feel the unnamed thing and look around for a bar. Wojciech Sobierajski found the proof the way most people found it, through the accumulated material that Goggins had produced over the years, the book and the videos and the interviews and the footage. He was in his mid-30s, Polish, a man with a documented history of physical extreme achievement, in cold weather endurance events that had established him clearly as someone who thought about discomfort differently from the majority of people. He had run a marathon in winter in only shorts and sandals, and had finished and had held the record for it. He was the kind of man who found a limit and treated it as a question rather than a boundary. He looked at 4,030 and felt the question. He trained for the specific demands of the record. He studied pacing, which was the central technical challenge of a 24-hour endurance event. Not maximum output, but sustainable output across the full duration. Output that was still available in hour 14 and hour 15, at a rate sufficient to make the target reachable. He studied grip management, the strategies for extending the useful life of the hands across the hours of friction that the record required. He prepared. He set his first attempt. He reached 1,150 pull-ups. He stopped there and went back to his attic and rebuilt his preparation around the specific failure that the first attempt had made visible. His pacing had collapsed in the middle hours, between 7 and 10, when the early energy was gone, and the end was not yet close enough to pull against. He had come in too fast and paid for it too soon. He fixed it. He booked his second attempt for the first day of January, 2025, New Year's Day. He set up his camera in his attic and arranged for his official Guinness witnesses, and got on the bar and pulled with the pacing he had rebuilt his preparation around. Slower in the early hours than he wanted to go, slower than felt natural, slower than the rate he had achieved at the start of the first attempt, but sustainable in a way the first attempt's pace had not been. He crossed 4,020. He kept going. He crossed 4,030. He reached 4,083 pull-ups in under 14 hours, before his arms would not give him more. He posted the video that evening. The title, in Polish, translated to, I smashed Goggins. Goggins number, 4,030, Guinness certified since 2013, attached to his name in the database for 11 years, was gone. The new benchmark was 4,083. And in a different attic in a different part of Poland, Patrick Cole watched the video on the morning of January 2nd and felt the calculation change. He had been training. He was in his mid-30s. He worked in technical services. He had a family and an ordinary, good life, and a pull-up bar in his attic that he had installed several years ago and had been using with increasing seriousness for the past year and a half, ever since he had found Goggins's story and felt the unnamed thing and started counting with more purpose than he had counted with before. He had not announced anything. He was not the kind of man who announced things before they were done. He was the kind of man who built toward something in private and then delivered it and let the delivery be the announcement. He looked at 4,083. He kept training. He trained through January and February. He rebuilt his pacing strategy around the new number. He prepared for the specific hours of the attempt that had ended attempts before, the middle hours, the hours without drama, the hours where the math either held or failed. In March, he decided he was ready. He filed with Guinness. He arranged witnesses. He told his wife. She had known. She had been listening through the ceiling every evening for months. He set the date for a Wednesday in early spring. The morning before, he ate carefully and slept as well as a man can sleep before something large. He woke before the sun. He went upstairs. He wrapped his hands. He got on the bar. He pulled for just under 16 hours. 4,111 pull-ups. 28 more than Wojciech. 81 more than Goggins. He sat on the floor of his attic when it was done, and his wife sat beside him, and he said to the camera, after a while, that he had been building toward this for a long time, and it was done now, and he hoped someone watching would decide to train harder tomorrow. The video went up. By morning, the number had changed. And the proof, the original proof, the one that Goggins had produced in a gym in Nashville in January 2013, the proof that the body's first signal was not the last word, was still traveling. It had moved from Nashville to Wojciech's attic on New Year's Day, and from there to Patrick's attic in the spring, and from there it was still moving, through the internet and the fitness community, and the general population of people who watched the footage and felt the unnamed thing, and started to calculate. Somewhere right now someone was feeling it for the first time. Somewhere right now someone was looking around for a bar. The record, 4,111, would not stand forever. It would fall when the next person trained hard enough and long enough, and declined the signal decisively enough, and climbed off the bar with a number the database had not held before. Not because they were superhuman, not because they had something the person reading this does not have, because the proof is available. And the proof says, you have more in you than you have used. The wall is real. So is the door. So is the 60% behind it. David Goggins set the record in Nashville. He held it for 11 years. It was taken from him on New Year's Day by a man in an attic, and that man's number was taken in another attic a few months later, and the chain is not finished. The chain is never finished. The recruiter who answered the call in the middle of winter, who gave the man his weight requirement and his timeline, and thought nothing more of it, he could not have known what he was setting in motion. He could not have known that the voice on the other end of the line was not going to become another note in his log that never produced a second call. He could not have known that 297 pounds was a starting point. He could not have known that the bar was waiting. He could not have known that Goggins would find it. But Goggins found it. And finding it changed everything downstream. Everything that came after the couch and the phone call and the 106 pounds in 3 months. Every pull-up in Nashville, every attic in Poland, every video on New Year's Day, every person who watched the footage and felt the unnamed thing and started counting. All of it was downstream of that one private moment when the signal arrived and was declined. The signal said done. He said not yet. Everything else is downstream of that. The bar is still there. It is waiting for the next person who says not yet. 6 months and 40,000 pull-ups of preparation, and none of it had prepared him for the bar on the Today Show. That is the fact that the training could not address. Not because the training was insufficient. The training was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 40,000 pull-ups in 6 months meant an average of more than 200 pull-ups every single day, including weekends, including sick days, including the days when his muscles were so deeply fatigued from the previous session that each rep felt like it was being done in wet concrete. The training was not the problem. The problem was the bar. It had give. In the language of structural engineering, give describes the way a material bends under load, rather than staying rigid. For a pull-up bar, a certain amount of give is present in almost all commercial gym equipment, and in a normal training context it produces no measurable effect on performance. When you do 15 pull-ups and step off the bar, the fraction of energy spent compensating for a slightly flexible bar is below the threshold of anything that matters. But David Goggins was not trying to do 15 pull-ups. He was trying to do 4,020 of them. The difference between a rigid bar and a bar with even moderate give, multiplied across 4,000 repetitions, is not a fractional difference. It is the difference between the attempt being possible and it not being. Every repetition on a flexible bar requires a slightly tighter grip to stabilize the movement. A tighter grip uses more muscle fibers. More muscle fibers engaged per pull-up means the muscles fatigue faster, means the reserves built over 6 months of preparation drain more quickly, means the wall arrives sooner than it should, and when it arrives, it is higher than the preparation can overcome. He felt all of this in the first 100 pull-ups. He kept going anyway. The Today Show studio on September 27, 2012, was not a place he would have chosen for a record attempt if choice had been his to exercise freely. The choice had been made by a friend who had seen an opportunity and taken it with the best intentions, a major national television program, millions of viewers, the kind of platform that most people in the fitness world would have considered an extraordinary gift. The logic was sound. The execution produced conditions that were precisely wrong. The lights were blazing in the specific way of commercial television production, the kind that fills every corner of a space with even, unrelenting brightness, and produces, over the course of hours, a particular kind of disorientation that is not dramatic enough to name, but is present enough to matter. His eyes had spent years adjusting to the kind of training environments he preferred. Controlled, dimly lit, private. And the studio lights made every element of the space feel slightly more effortful to process than it should have. There were people everywhere. Not hostile people. Not people who wished him anything but success. Hosts who were professionally warm and genuinely interested. Producers coordinating the logistics of the production through earpieces and clipboards. crew members moving cameras from position to position, and through the enormous glass window at the front of the studio, the street and the people on it. New York City conducting its morning, some portion of which had slowed to look through the glass at the man preparing to do something unusual inside the studio, some of them pressing phones to the glass to take photographs. Goggins was not a performer. He was a worker. These were not the same thing. The distinction is important. Performing and working both involve effort, and both produce visible output, but they draw from different reserves and require different internal states. Performing required him to be in relationship with the people watching, to be aware of the cameras, to acknowledge the audience, to manage the social dimension of the event alongside the physical one. Working required him to be entirely absent to everything except the task, the bar, the count, the ongoing management of pace and grip and energy across hours. He had spent 6 months training to work. The studio required him to perform. He gripped the bar. He pulled. He counted. For 2,588 pull-ups and 5.5 hours, he held both, the work and the performance, the count and the cameras, the pace and the people watching through the glass. He held all of it with the specific, concentrated effort of someone managing more variables than the task was designed to contain. At 2,588, his left forearm announced itself. This is the specific language of a partial muscle tear. Announcement. It does not ask permission. It does not present itself as information to be weighed against other information and incorporated into an ongoing decision. It announces that the architecture has failed at a specific point, and that loading that point further will make the failure worse, and the announcement has a quality that cuts through every level of mental discipline that Goggins had developed, because it is not pain making a case. It is damage reporting a fact. He stopped. He climbed down from the bar. He thanked the hosts in the professional way that the moment required. He walked out of the studio and into the cold outside air of Manhattan, and stood for a moment in the particular combination of exhaustion and frustration, an already forming analysis that belonged to the man he had become. He was not done. He was just not done today. He was done with this bar, this studio, this particular set of wrong conditions. He was not done with the record, and he was not done with the question of whether 4,020 pull-ups in 24 hours was something his body could produce when the conditions were right. He needed a different bar. He needed a different environment. He needed his forearm to heal. All three of those things were achievable. He drove home and began working on the list. Nashville came to him as the solution to 2 of the 3 problems simultaneously. His mother lived there, which meant he had a place to stay and a support structure that did not require additional logistics. Near her home was a CrossFit gym, CrossFit Brentwood Hills, that he had visited before and that had a bar he had tested and confirmed. Rigid, fixed, the kind that stayed in place when you put your weight on it, and required only your actual effort to complete each rep, rather than your actual effort, plus the additional tax of stability work. The environment was semi-private. Gym members could attend and support him, but there were no television cameras in the production sense, no live broadcast, no glass window facing a busy street, no performance dimension layered on top of the work dimension. He booked it for November 27, 2012, 2 months after the studio. In those 2 months, he let his forearm heal, and he thought carefully about his hands. The forearm tear had ended the studio attempt before his palms became the central problem, which meant the studio attempt, for all its failure, had not yet shown him the full cost that a pull-up record extracted from the hands. But he knew it theoretically, and he knew it from talking to people who had done sustained pull-up training at high volume, and what he knew was this: thousands of contacts between human skin and a metal bar, over hours, produced a progression that was entirely predictable and not at all pleasant. It started with heat. The friction between grip and metal generated warmth that was initially negligible and became, over time, the first warning. Then friction burns, the reddening and tenderness of skin that has been in sustained contact with an abrasive surface. Then blisters, as the deeper layers of skin responded to the ongoing damage by producing protective fluid pockets. Then the blisters opened. Then, in the serious stages, the skin itself began to separate from the connective tissue beneath it. This was not a scenario he could prevent. It was a timeline he could only manage. extending the stages, delaying the most serious damage, buying enough time in functional grip to complete the count before the hands became the limiting factor. He wore 3 pairs of gloves for the Nashville attempt, layered. He used chalk. He got on the bar. 150 pull-ups in, the burning started. Not the dramatic, sharp burning of an injury, the steady, deepening heat of friction doing its patient work through layers of protective fabric. He acknowledged it and continued. He had prepared himself, mentally, for this moment and the moments after it, had trained himself not to let the arrival of the burning change anything about his rate or his focus. He kept pulling. The count climbed. Hours passed. In the 3rd hour, he began managing his grip more actively, rotating slightly, finding positions that put a different section of his palm against the bar, allowing the previously loaded areas a few seconds of relative rest before they returned to contact. He had practiced this. His hands moved through the adjustments automatically. Hour 5. Hour 7. The burning in his hands had deepened through its progression, and was now in the serious stage that preceded blistering. He was still pulling. The count was building well on this bar, on this environment, with this focus. Better than the studio. Measurably better. The rigid bar doing the work it was supposed to do. Hour 10. He took his first break. He reached up and pulled the gloves from his hands. Layers of skin came away with the gloves. Not all of it. Not in a way that made continuing immediately impossible. But the quantity was significant enough that he stood for a moment looking at what his hands had become, understanding that the next several hours of the attempt would be conducted on surfaces that were no longer intact, that every contact with the bar going forward would be reported more completely than any contact before it. He got back on the bar. He found the grip positions that were still usable. He worked his way through them. Some reps on the tips of his fingers where the pads were still relatively undamaged. Some with his wrists, pressing the bones of his forearm against the bar in the places where his palms could not function. He kept counting. He kept going. 3,000, 3,100, 3,200. At 3,207, he ran the numbers. The rate at which he was completing pull-ups, reduced by the need to find alternative grip positions, reduced by the cumulative drag of hands that were no longer intact and working surfaces but raw and sensitive, and reporting every contact at full volume. That rate had fallen below what the remaining time allowed. He needed to complete 713 more pull-ups to break the record. The time remaining and the pace he could currently sustain did not produce 713. The mathematics were clear and not recoverable. He stopped at 3,207. He stood in the gym. His hands were ruined. His forearms were exhausted. His count was 813 pull-ups short of a world record, and he had 2 failed attempts behind him, and he was standing in a CrossFit gym in Nashville in late November, with people around him who did not know what to say. He understood what to say. He knew exactly what to say, not to the people in the gym, but to himself, in the private internal language that had carried him through every other difficulty he had ever faced. He said, "The hands are the problem. The hands are fixable." He stood there for a while longer. He thought about what fixing the hands required. He thought about protective material, and what Guinness would approve, and what would protect the skin, without compromising the grip enough to sacrifice the rate. He thought about foam and density, and custom fabrication. He thought about calling a mattress company. He picked up the phone. The company listened to what he needed. They understood the problem, the sustained friction, the progressive skin damage, the specific pressure distribution of a grip on a metal bar, repeated thousands of times. They produced custom foam pads, built for exactly this application. He submitted them to Guinness with a description of their construction and their purpose. Guinness approved the pads as a legitimate modification within the rules of the record attempt. He scheduled the 3rd attempt. January 20th, 2013. CrossFit Brentwood Hills. The same gym, the same bar, the same city that had watched him come up short in November, the same cold Tennessee winter outside. He drove to Nashville with the foam pads, and with something that could not be packaged or certified, but that was the most important thing he was bringing, the specific internal state of a man who has already settled the question of what is going to happen, and has come to be present for the physical execution of the answer. He had lost 2 attempts. In the language of most people's experience of failure, 2 failed attempts would be the story, the thing that ended the chapter, the thing that got filed under tried and didn't make it. In his experience of failure, 2 failed attempts were data that had been fully processed and acted upon, and the processing and the action had produced modifications that addressed every identifiable failure point, and there was nothing remaining on the list. The list was empty. The bar was there. He wrapped his hands in the custom foam. He chalked up. He stood in front of the bar for a moment, in the way of a man who has no remaining argument with the outcome. He reached up and gripped it. He pulled. The first pull-up of the third attempt had the same mechanical properties as any other pull-up he had ever done. Hands on bar, arms bent, body lifted, arms extended, body lowered. Nothing about the motion was different, but something about the quality of the moment was different, and the people in the gym could feel it without being able to name it. The specific gravity of something being done, not as an attempt, but as an execution. He set his pace. Not the fastest pace his body could sustain in the opening hours, but the pace his preparation told him would still be executable in hour 13 and hour 14, when the energy of the beginning had been spent, and the proximity of the end had not yet arrived to carry him. He had learned from the first 2 attempts that the record did not go to the person who went fastest at the start. It went to the person who went at the right speed from the beginning, and never deviated. He did not deviate. Hour 3, hour 5, hour 7. The count climbed at the planned rate. His hands, in the foam pads, were accumulating damage on a slower timeline than the November attempt. The pads were distributing the pressure across a larger surface area, buying him time without the foam's compression under grip, costing him more energy than the protection was worth. Hour 9. He was on pace. The math of the remaining hours was still solvent. Hour 12. 3,000 pull-ups. He was exhausted in the comprehensive way that 12 hours of pull-ups produces exhaustion, not just in the obvious muscles but in everything that supported the movement from less obvious angles, the back and the core and the stabilizers that kept his body in the right position across thousands of repetitions of the same motion. He was deeply, thoroughly tired, and he was on pace, and the remaining hours were manageable, and the decision had already been made. He kept going. Hour 13, hour 14, hour 15, hour 16. The count climbed toward the threshold that had been set in Britain in 2011 by Stephen Hyland, who had done 4,020 pull-ups, and then rested, and then received his Guinness certificate, and had spent the next year and a half watching it remain in the database unmoved, because nobody had come along who was willing to pay the specific price required to take it. David Goggins came along. He was willing to pay it. At 17 hours, he stepped off the bar. 4,030 pull-ups. The gym was quiet before it was loud. The quiet had the quality of a room where people have been collectively holding their breath for a very long time, and the thing that required holding it has just been resolved. Then the noise came, the specific kind that arrives when people have witnessed something they will not forget, and the permission to express the full weight of witnessing it has finally been given. 4,030. 10 more than the record. 7 hours remaining on the 24-hour clock. He had not needed the full time. He had needed 17 hours and the right bar and the right environment and custom foam pads from a mattress company, and 67,000 pull-ups of preparation, and the specific internal quality of a man who had learned, over years of applying it to every domain of his life, that the body's first signal was not the last word. The record was certified. The story was told. The proof was complete. And it began, immediately and without announcement, to travel. It moved through the fitness community the way proof of this kind always moves, not with the explosive spread of entertainment, but with the persistent, widening reach of something that contains a transmissible truth. People who found the story shared it. People who found the footage of the Nashville attempt watched it, and then watched it again, and then thought about what they would need to be willing to do to produce a result like that, and some of them put those thoughts away, and some of them did not. The 40% rule traveled with the story. The idea that the signal the body sends when it wants to stop is not an accurate report of capacity, but a conservative estimate, a margin of safety built by evolution to protect a body that could not afford to be wrong about its limits. That idea moved through the people who encountered the story and changed their calculation of what was available. It changed the calculation for Wojciech Sobierajski, who would eventually be the one to take the record from Goggins in his own attic on New Year's Day in 2025. It changed the calculation for Patrick Cole, who was training in a different attic in Poland, with no public announcement, and a bar he had installed years earlier, with vague intentions that had become, over the course of 18 months of increasingly serious use, the most specific purpose he had ever given a piece of exercise equipment. The proof traveled toward both of them. It arrived in the way that proof always arrives, not as a command but as a demonstration, not "you must do this," but "this is what is available." And what they did with it was what David Goggins had done with the footage of the men in Bud's training. They looked at it, they felt the unnamed thing, and they started calculating. The calculation had consequences. Those consequences were about to become visible. In Nashville, in a gym in January 2013, 4,030 was a number on a bar. In Poland, in 2 attics, it was a question. The question would be answered. The attic above the house in Poland was not remarkable from the outside. From the outside, it was the roofline of an ordinary house on an ordinary street, the kind of residential neighborhood that exists in every mid-sized European city, the kind that people drive through without looking at, and that means something specific only to the people who live in it. The street was quiet, in the way of streets that are not in the center of anything. The house was maintained without being notable. The attic, if you looked at it from the street, was just a set of dormered windows under a pitched roof, the kind of architectural feature that indicates extra storage space and nothing more. Inside, the attic was also not remarkable. Storage boxes, seasonal items, the accumulated overflow of a life being lived in the rooms below. A pull-up bar installed at some earlier point with honest but general intentions about fitness, intentions that had been honored intermittently over the years in the way that home gym equipment is usually honored, with genuine use, followed by extended dormancy, followed by renewed genuine use, followed by further dormancy, in the alternating rhythm of ordinary people and ordinary motivation. The man who lived in the house below the attic was Wojciech Sobierajski. He was in his mid-30s. He worked. He had a life that functioned well in all the visible ways. He also had a documented history with physical extremity that made the word athlete feel like a category that did not quite contain him, not because the word was wrong, but because his relationship with physical limits was more personal and more complicated than the word usually implied. He had run a marathon in winter wearing only shorts and sandals. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. Not gloves and a running jacket and thermal leggings and shoes designed for cold weather performance. Shorts and sandals. In winter, 26.2 miles. He had prepared for it, calibrated his training to the specific demands of extreme cold on an underprotected body, and then executed it, and then held the record for it. He was the kind of man who encountered a physical limit and felt something specific. Not the version of respect that most people felt when they looked at the outer edge of what the body could sustain. The respect that kept a safe and comfortable distance. What he felt was more like curiosity, an interest in what was on the other side of the limit, in the specifics of what it would take to get there, and what it would be like to be there, in the question of whether the limit was where it appeared to be, or whether that appearance was, as Goggins' 40% rule suggested about all perceived limits, a conservative estimate rather than a fact. He found Goggins' story the way most people found it, through the internet, through the fitness community that had made Goggins into a kind of patron figure for extreme physical effort, through the book and the interviews and the specific footage of a man in a gym in Nashville with custom foam pads on his hands pulling himself up and down a bar for 17 hours until a number in a Guinness database changed. Wojciech watched the footage. He read the details. 67,000 pull-ups in preparation, 3 attempts, 2 failures, a forearm tear on national television, skin coming off in the gloves in Nashville in November, the custom foam pads from the mattress company, the 17 hours on January 20th, 2013, and the 4,030 at the end of them. He looked at 4,030. He did not feel awe, exactly. He felt the question. He started training. The training he built for the pull-up record was different in its architecture from the training he had done for cold weather endurance events. Cold weather events demanded a specific kind of thermal resilience, the ability of the body to regulate its core temperature under conditions that threatened to bring it below the range compatible with functional performance. Pull-up records demanded something different, the capacity for sustained, repeated, mechanical output at a specific rate, across an extraordinarily long period of time, with the progressive deterioration of the most critical interface between the athlete and the equipment, the hands, being not a risk to be avoided, but a certainty to be managed. He studied pacing with the seriousness of someone who understood that pacing was the central technical problem of the attempt. In a sprint or a short race, pacing means something relatively simple, going at the rate that will produce the best time over a fixed distance. In a 24-hour endurance record, pacing means something more complicated and more consequential, going at the rate that is still executable in hour 14, when the energy of the first hour is entirely gone, and the proximity of the end has not yet arrived to provide the final push. The rate that feels natural and energetic at the start of a pull-up record attempt is, in most cases, the rate that destroys the attempt in the middle hours. The rate that feels conservatively slow at the start is, in most cases, the rate that makes the end reachable. This was not an intuitive insight. It was a counterintuitive one, which meant it required deliberate training to embody, rather than just understanding intellectually. Wojciech trained his pacing specifically, practicing at rates that felt uncomfortably slow in the early phases of a training session, until the rate became normalized, until his body stopped arguing that it could go faster, and accepted the rate as the correct one. He studied grip management with equal seriousness. The hands were going to deteriorate. The only variable was how quickly the deterioration reached the point where the most critical grip positions became unusable, forcing him to find alternatives that were less efficient and that would drain his rate. He developed a rotation strategy, a sequence of grip positions that distributed the wear across different areas of his hand, buying time in the early positions by cycling through alternatives rather than loading the same spot until it failed. He trained the rotation until it was automatic, until he did not need to think about which position came next, because his hands had learned the sequence. He prepared his nutritional approach for a 17-plus-hour effort. He tested fueling strategies in training, identifying the foods and timing that sustained his output without the energy crashes that certain nutritional choices produced in the middle hours of long events. He trained for several months. He announced his intention publicly. The fitness community received the announcement with a mixture of genuine interest and the careful skepticism that extreme record claims always attracted before they were validated. The pull-up record had stood for over a decade. People had talked about taking it before. The record remained at 4,030. Goggins, for his part, said nothing publicly. He had held the record long enough to understand that records were positions rather than possessions, and that positions were held only until someone was willing to pay the current price of occupying them. He had paid the price in 2013. Someone was now preparing to pay a different price, and if they paid it fully enough, the record would move. Wojciech set his first attempt. He reached 1,150 pull-ups before stopping. From the outside, this looked unambiguous. A significant shortfall, well below a third of the target. An attempt that ended without getting close to the objective. And it was a shortfall. But the way Wojciech processed it was entirely different from the way a casual observer would categorize it. He had not expected to break the record on his first attempt in the way that most people who go into a first attempt at a difficult record expect to succeed. He had expected to gather information, and the information he gathered was specific and actionable. His pacing had collapsed in the middle hours. He had gone too fast in the first 2 hours and paid for it in hours 6, 7, and 8, when the rate dropped below what was sustainable, and the drop compounded with the accumulating fatigue, until the math became unrecoverable. The failure was not a failure of capacity. It was a failure of pacing strategy, which meant it was correctable. He went back to his attic. He rebuilt his pacing from the ground up, starting from the failure point of the first attempt, and working backward to identify what he had done in the first 2 hours that had made hours 6, 7, and 8 unsustainable. He found the rate. He trained at it. He practiced in the specific hours that had proved difficult, until those hours were no longer the worst of the attempt but simply part of a continuum he had mapped. He rethought his grip strategy for the later stages of the attempt, the stages that the first attempt had not reached, when the hands would be in the serious damaged condition that required alternative positions. He had not needed that part of his preparation on the first attempt, because the first attempt had ended before the hands became the limiting factor. Now he prepared for it specifically, training the grip alternatives that would be available in hours 10, 11, and 12 when the primary positions were no longer functional. He built back. He rebuilt carefully. He booked his second attempt for the first day of January, 2025. New Year's Day was a choice that had a particular quality to it, the quality of a clean start, a fresh calendar, the specific symbolism of the first day of a new year, as the day a thing begins, or the day a thing is finished. Wojciech was not primarily a symbolic man. He was a practical man who had studied a problem and was now executing a solution. But the date had an appropriateness to it that the practical man in him did not object to. He set up his camera in his attic. He contacted the official Guinness witnesses and arranged for their presence on the day, as the rules of a record attempt required. He prepared his equipment. He prepared his food and water for the hours ahead. He told the people who needed to know. He went to bed on December 31st, and slept, and woke, and went upstairs. The attic on the morning of January 1st was cold in the early hours, with the cold that accumulated in unheated upper rooms overnight. He did not turn on heat that would warm the space too much. A room that was too warm would produce its own complications for a long pull-up attempt, the specific problem of elevated body temperature adding to the thermal load of the effort itself. He preferred cool. He dressed appropriately. He positioned himself under the bar. He gripped it. He began. The pacing in the first 2 hours was the single most important thing he was doing. Not the number of pull-ups. The number would follow from the pacing. The pacing was the decision that determined everything downstream. He had rebuilt his preparation around the rate that was sustainable across the full duration, and now he held that rate without allowing the excess energy of the early hours to seduce him into going faster. The early hours always offered this seduction. The body felt good. The muscles were fresh. The rate could easily be higher. The higher rate would feel like progress. It was a trap, and he had fallen into it in November, and he did not fall into it again. He moved through the first hour at the rate. He moved through the second hour at the rate. The count built at the planned pace. His witnesses were quiet, noting the count at regular intervals. The camera ran. Hour 3. Hour 4. The early friction damage to his hands began at the expected point, the gradual onset of heat that announced the beginning of the progression he had prepared for. He applied the first grip adjustment in the rotation he had trained, moving to a position that gave the primary contact area a few seconds of relative relief, while a different area took the load. The adjustment was small. It was automatic. His hands moved through it without requiring his attention, which meant his attention could remain on the count and the pacing. Hour 5. Hour 6. This was the approach to the territory that had failed him in the first attempt. The hours between 5 and 8, when the early energy was no longer available, and the end was still many hours away, and the middle offered no particular reason to continue, except that continuing was the decision. He had trained in this territory specifically. He had made it familiar. He moved through it. Hour 7. Hour 8. The count was on pace. He was in the middle hours, and the middle hours were hard, and the middle hours did not stop being hard because he had prepared for them. They were simply hard in a way he was familiar with, rather than hard in a way that surprised him, which made all the difference. Hour 9. Hour 10. His hands by hour 10 were in the serious stage. The progression had moved past blistering and into the territory where the outer layers were gone in several locations, and the contact between the remaining skin and the bar was direct and comprehensive, and reported at full volume. He applied the alternative grip positions he had prepared for this stage, the positions he had not needed in the first attempt because the first attempt had ended before this point. They were available. He had trained them. His hands moved through them with the same automaticity as the earlier adjustments. The count climbed. 3,000, 3,200, 3,500, 3,800. The witnesses counted and noted. The camera ran. Outside, the first day of 2025 was doing what first days of New Year's always did, arriving quietly in the hours when most people were still recovering from the evening before, bringing a new calendar and the ordinary promise that this year might be different from the last. In the attic, the count was approaching the record. 4,000, 4,010, 4,015. He crossed 4,020. Stephen Hyland's record, set in Britain in 2011. Gone. He kept going. 4,025. 4,030. Goggins' record, the number that had stood since January 20th, 2013. The number built on 67,000 pull-ups of preparation, and 3 attempts and a forearm tear on national television, and a Nashville gym and custom foam pads from a mattress company. The number attached to the name David Goggins in the Guinness database for 11 years. Gone. He kept going. 4,040. 4,050. 4,060. 4,070. His arms were in the final stages of what they could give. The condition of his grip had moved past the alternative positions and was in the territory where any grip at all required a specific and diminishing effort to maintain. He knew what the arms felt like when they were done. He knew the difference between done in the way of the 40% rule, the body's conservative estimate, the signal that could be declined, and done in the way of actual depletion, which could not. His arms were approaching the actual depletion. He reached 4,083. He stopped. He lowered himself from the bar and stood in his attic on the first day of 2025, in under 14 hours, with 4,083 pull-ups behind him and a Guinness World Record that was no longer David Goggins' Guinness World Record. He said that today, in his attic, he had managed to do 4,083 pull-ups in less than 14 hours, and the condition of his arms had not allowed for more. He posted the video that evening on his YouTube channel. The title was in Polish. It translated to, "I smashed Goggins." The video spread through the night and into the morning. By the time the first full day of 2025 had fully arrived, the fitness world knew that Goggins' record was gone. The reaction had the specific texture of moments when something long established is suddenly no longer established, a mixture of genuine excitement at the new achievement and the particular adjustment that comes when a number that had come to feel permanent is demonstrated to be provisional. 4,083 was the new benchmark. Goggins' 4,030 was no longer the ceiling. It was history. And in a different attic in a different part of Poland, Patrick Cole woke up on the morning of January 2nd and watched the video and felt the calculation change. He had been training. He was in his mid-30s. He worked in technical services, the kind of work that required precision and patience and a methodical approach to complex problems. He had a family. He had a house with an attic that contained, among the ordinary contents of an ordinary attic, a pull-up bar that had been installed several years earlier, with genuine but general fitness intentions. About 18 months before that January morning, he had found Goggins' story. Finding it had done what it did to everyone it reached. It had shifted the calculation, not in a dramatic, singular moment of revelation, more gradually than that, the way a persistent pressure shifts something that seemed solid. He had started using the pull-up bar more seriously. He had started counting with the kind of purpose that had a destination attached to it, rather than the purpose of general fitness maintenance. He had developed a training approach that was specific rather than general, aimed at the particular demands of a long endurance record, rather than the ordinary objectives of a person who wanted to be in better shape. He had not told anyone what he was building toward. He was not the kind of man who announced things before they existed. He was the kind of man who built toward something in private, and delivered it when it was done, and let the delivery be the announcement. Now Wojciech had moved the number. Patrick looked at 4,083. He saw a target. He kept training. He kept training through January of 2025, through February, through March. He rebuilt his pacing strategy around the new number. He refined his grip management. He prepared for the specific hours of the attempt that had ended previous attempts, the middle hours, the hours between 7 and 10 where the early energy was gone, and the end was not yet available. He had been preparing for those hours already, but he prepared more specifically now, with the benefit of Wojciech's video showing him the exact progression of a successful attempt and the hours where it was hardest. In late March, he made a decision. He was ready. He filed his intention with Guinness through the proper channels. He arranged for official witnesses. He set a date, a Wednesday in early spring. He told his wife what he was going to do. She had already known. She said she would be there. The night before the attempt, he ate carefully. He slept as well as anyone sleeps the night before something large. Imperfectly, with intervals of wakefulness that were not productive, but were also not particularly distressing, because he had done everything that could be done in preparation, and there was nothing remaining to do except arrive at the morning. He arrived at the morning. He went upstairs. He stood in the attic in the early gray light of a spring day, and looked at the bar. He thought about the chain of decisions that had brought him here, his own, and Wojciech's, and Goggins before Wojciech's, and going further back, the decision Goggins had made on the couch in front of the television, the private one that had preceded everything. The proof had traveled this far. He was going to carry it one step further. He wrapped his hands. He positioned himself under the bar. He reached up. He gripped it. He pulled. The first pull-up had the same mechanical properties as every other pull-up he had done in that attic over the past 18 months. Hands on bar, arms bent, body lifted, arms extended, body lowered. Nothing about the motion was new, but the quality of the moment was specific, the quality of something that has been prepared for carefully, and is now simply happening, the way a thing happens when it has been thoroughly decided. He set his pace. The pace he had spent months training at, the rate that felt conservatively slow in the first hour and would still be executable in hour 14. He did not go faster because the early hours offered the energy to go faster. He held the rate. He pulled. He counted. He managed his hands through the progression of stages with the rotation strategy he had trained until it was automatic. Hour 1, hour 2, hour 3. His wife came upstairs at hour 4 and sat in the corner of the attic without saying anything. The witnesses were positioned. The camera ran. Through the small window of the attic, the spring morning was audible as a distant texture, the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood doing its ordinary things. Hour 5, hour 6. He entered the difficult territory. The middle hours. The hours that had ended Wojciech's first attempt and that he had prepared for specifically, training in them until they were familiar, and the familiarity made them survivable, even when surviving them did not feel easy. He survived them. Hour 7. Hour 8. The count moved at the rate he had planned. His hands by hour 8 were seriously damaged. Past the blistering stage, into the territory of raw contact and full reporting. He applied the alternative grip positions. His hands moved through them automatically. Hour 9. Hour 10. His wife brought food and water. He fueled and returned to the bar. Hour 11. Hour 12. The mathematics resolved at hour 12. Current count, current pace, time remaining. The numbers produced the outcome he had been building toward. He was on track. The record was reachable. He kept going. Hour 13. He crossed 3,500. Hour 14. He crossed 4,020. Hyland's number. He crossed 4,030. Goggins' number. He crossed 4,083. Wojciech's number. He kept going. He kept going because the 40% rule, which had traveled from a couch in New York, through a Nashville gym, and 2 Polish attics, and into this one, said that done was not done until it actually was, and his arms had not yet delivered that message. 4,090. 4,100. At 4,111, something settled. Not a crisis, not a collapse, a completion. The specific quality of a thing that has been fully done. He lowered himself from the bar. He sat on the floor of his attic. He sat there for a while without moving. His hands were in the condition that record attempts left hands in. His arms felt like objects that happened to be attached to him. His entire upper body had spent 16 hours in sustained effort and was operating at the outer edge of what was available after that. His wife sat beside him on the floor. After a long time, he looked at the camera. He said he had been building toward this for a long time. He said it was done now. He said he hoped someone watching would decide to train harder tomorrow. The video went up that evening. By morning, 4,111 was the number. By morning, Patrick Cole had carried the proof one more step, and the proof was still traveling. It was moving through the internet, and the fitness community, and the general population of people who found it, and felt the unnamed thing, and started to calculate. It was moving toward the next attic, the next bar, the next person who would look at 4,111, The way Wojciech had looked at 4030, the way Patrick had looked at 4083, not with awe, but with the specific, practical, consequential question of what it would require. The answer to that question was always the same. It required the 40% rule, applied faithfully and completely, in the middle hours when no one was watching, and the distance remaining felt larger than the distance covered. It required the original decision, the private one, the one that had no audience. It required the refusal of the first signal. The record would fall again. This was not pessimism. It was the most hopeful statement available about the nature of human capacity, which does not have a ceiling, but only the current highest point anyone has yet reached. The current highest point was 4111. Someone was already training. What the Guinness database cannot hold is the shape of the silence that exists in the preparation hours. Not the attempt hours. Those have been documented. 17 hours in Nashville, 14 hours in a Polish attic, 16 hours in another. Those hours are on film, witnessed, certified. The count is in the records. What is not in any record is the shape of the 6 months before Nashville, the 12 months before New Year's Day in 2025, the 18 months before the Wednesday in spring. The shape of those months is not dramatic. It is almost entirely undramatic. It is the shape of evenings when someone goes upstairs when they could have stayed downstairs. The shape of a daily decision made privately, without audience, without external accountability, with nothing to hold the decision in place, except the decision itself. David Goggins performed 40,000 pull-ups in 6 months of preparation, and nobody was watching any of them. That fact contains everything essential about the 40% rule, that the rule itself does not say directly. The rule says that you have more in you than you have used. What it does not say, but what the 40,000 pull-ups demonstrate, is that accessing the more requires a preparation that is itself governed by the same rule. You do not reach 60% capacity in an attempt by preparing at 40% capacity. You reach it by preparing at 60%, which requires applying the rule to the preparation, the way you will later apply it to the attempt, declining the signal that says enough, continuing past the point where continuing stopped feeling productive, building in the hours when no one will ever know whether you went upstairs or watched television. Patrick Cole went upstairs every evening for 18 months. Nobody was watching. His wife could hear the bar through the ceiling. That was the only external record of what was happening in the attic. A sound, a rhythm, the consistent, patient sound of a man who had made a decision in private and was honoring it in private, evening after evening, building something that would only become visible on the day it was complete. This is the invisible part of every record, not the preparation in the general sense. Most people know that records require preparation. The word preparation is not news. The invisible part is the quality of the commitment that preparation requires, the specific kind of daily renewal that does not look like inspiration and does not feel like motivation, but is something more durable than both, the maintenance of a decision made once and held through the days when nothing external was reinforcing it. Goggins made the decision on a couch in front of a television. Wojciech made the decision in his attic after 1,150 pull-ups that told him what he needed to fix. Patrick made the decision sometime in the 18 months before anyone knew his name. Each decision was made in private. Each one was maintained in private. Each one produced a public result that appeared, to the people who saw only the result, to be the consequence of extraordinary gift or extraordinary circumstance, rather than the consequence of an ordinary decision made consistently over an extended period. The ordinary decision. That is the part that the story is actually about. Not the record, the decision underneath it. Not the attic, the evenings when someone chose the attic over the couch. Not the bar, the hands on the bar, when the signal was saying stop and the hands kept going anyway. The record is the evidence. The decision is the thing. And the decision is available to anyone. That is the most important sentence in this story, and it is also the most easily dismissed one, because it sounds like the generic inspirational language that wraps around accounts of extreme achievement to make the achievement seem more universal than it is. But it is not generic, it is specific. The decision is available to anyone because the mechanism of the 40% rule is not a property of exceptional people. It is a property of human bodies. All human bodies. The signal arrives at 40% in the body of a retired Navy SEAL, and the body of a Polish athlete in his attic, and the body of the next person who will find the footage and feel the unnamed thing, and start calculating. The signal is universal. So is the 60% behind it. What is not universal is the willingness to decline the signal. But willingness is not a gift. It is a practice. It is built through repeated application, which is why Goggins' first pull-up in his 6 months of preparation was not the same as his last one. The willingness at the end of 6 months was stronger than the willingness at the beginning, because it had been exercised 6 months' worth of times. The practice of declining the signal, practiced daily, in private, in the preparation hours that nobody watches, produces a version of the willingness that is available when the attempt arrives. Not because the attempt is easier than the preparation, but because the preparation has built the specific capacity for the moment that the attempt requires. Wojciech's second attempt was different from his first, not because he had done more training. He had, but the additional training was not the primary factor. It was different because his understanding of where his limit actually was had been corrected by the first attempt. The first attempt had produced information that told him the limit was not where he thought it was, that the rate he had used in the first 2 hours was not sustainable, that the specific hours between 7 and 10 were the critical ones, and that preparing for them specifically was the work that would determine the outcome. The correction of that understanding changed the second attempt in ways that additional training alone could not have changed it. He did not simply train harder, he trained more accurately. That is a different thing. Patrick's preparation was built on information he had from both Goggins and Wojciech before he ever gripped his bar for an official attempt. He had the record of 3 attempts from Nashville and 2 from Poland, with their failure points documented and their successful strategies visible. He had a more complete picture of what the record required than any of his predecessors had when they began, which meant his preparation could be more targeted than theirs. His pacing could be more precisely calibrated to the actual demands of the record. His grip strategy could incorporate the lessons that previous attempts had made visible. He stood on the work of the people before him. This is always true of records. The person who holds the record today holds it partly on the accumulated knowledge of everyone who attempted it before them, everyone whose failure documented a specific difficulty, and whose success demonstrated a specific solution. The database changes. The knowledge compounds. 4,111 is the current number. The knowledge that produced it is available to the next person who comes along and decides they want to know what they contain. The bar is there. The knowledge is there. The decision is the only remaining variable. The records that get broken are the ones that mattered enough to be attempted. That sounds simple. It is not simple. Most things that look simple contain an enormous amount of invisible structure, and this sentence contains the invisible structure of everything David Goggins built between a couch in upstate New York and a pull-up bar in Nashville. The record at 4,030 mattered enough to be attempted because Goggins had spent 6 months and 40,000 pull-ups making himself the kind of person who could attempt it. The attempt on the Today Show mattered enough to learn from. The attempt in Nashville in November mattered enough to stop, analyze, and improve. The third attempt mattered enough to execute completely, to 17 hours and 4,030 pull-ups, to the last available fraction of what the preparation had built. And because it mattered enough to be completed that thoroughly, it became the kind of proof that travels. Stephen Hyland's 4,020 had mattered to him, and had traveled less far, not because it was a lesser achievement, but because the story around it did not contain the specific transmissible elements that Goggins' story contained. Goggins' story had the failures. It had the custom foam pads from the mattress company, and the skin coming off in the gloves, and the partial muscle tear on national television. It had the 67,000 pull-ups in preparation that nobody asked for, and nobody was watching, and that existed purely because he understood that the 40% rule applied to preparation too, that you did not train for 4,000 pull-ups by training to do 4,000 pull-ups, but by training to be the kind of person who had 4,000 available when the moment required them. The story had all of that, and so it traveled with a force that records without those elements could not carry. It reached Wojciech Sobierajski in his attic in Poland. Wojciech was already extraordinary before the proof reached him. He had already demonstrated, through the marathon in shorts and sandals and the other cold weather records that preceded his pull-up attempt, that he was a man who had developed a working relationship with the outer edge of physical capacity. He already understood, in his own terms, something adjacent to the 40% rule. The understanding that the signal the body sends when it wants to stop is worth questioning, that there is territory on the other side of that signal that most people never find, because they accept the signal without questioning it. But the specific framing of the 40% rule, the specific, transmissible idea that the done feeling arrives at 40% and that 60% remains, every single time, that arrived to Wojciech through Gogin's story and changed something in how he thought about what was available on the other side of his own signals. He failed at 1,150 on his first attempt. He came back with 4,083 on his second. The gap between those two numbers is not just physical improvement. It is not simply a matter of stronger muscles or better grip technique, though those elements were present. It is the gap that opens when a person understands specifically what went wrong and corrects it without making the correction into something more than it is, without inflating the failure into evidence of a fundamental limitation, and without dismissing it as a one-time anomaly. He looked at the failure with the same practical clarity that he brought to the design of a record attempt, found the specific problem, and fixed it. And Patrick Cole, training in his own attic in private for 18 months before he ever filed with Guinness, received the proof from two sources: Gogins's original demonstration in Nashville and Wojciech's demonstration on New Year's Day. He received it and applied it and arrived at 4,111 on a Wednesday in spring, done before most people in his neighborhood had finished their dinner. He did not celebrate in the way that people celebrate on television. He sat on the floor of his attic, and his wife sat beside him, and after a while he looked at the camera and said he hoped someone watching would decide to train harder tomorrow. That sentence is doing a lot of work. It is doing the same work that Gogin's story has always done, not telling people what they are capable of in a general, inspirational sense, but pointing at a specific mechanism and saying, this is how it works. The signal comes early, you decline it. You find what is behind it. What is behind it is 60% of what you contain, available, waiting for the decision that unlocks it. The decision cannot be made once in a general sense and applied to all situations. It has to be made specifically, at the specific moment when the specific signal arrives, the moment in hour 8 when the grip is starting to fail, and the body is sending every message available to it, and the remaining hours are still many, and the count is not yet where it needs to be. The decision has to be made at that moment, not before it and not after it. At that moment, the person either declines the signal or they do not. David Goggins spent his entire adult life developing the capacity to decline it. He built that capacity through the 100-pound weight loss, and the Buds graduation, and the Ranger School, and the Iraq deployment, and the Afghanistan grief, channeled into ultramarathons, and the Today Show failure, and the November Nashville failure, and the 17 hours in January 2013. He built it one decision at a time, at the specific moment when the signal arrived, in the specific private way that no one was watching. Wojciech built a version of it through cold weather records and his own specific experience of what was behind the signal. Patrick built a version of it through 18 months of quiet evenings in an attic above his kitchen, going upstairs when he could have watched television, building toward something that he did not announce because he was building rather than announcing. Each of them arrived at the bar with what they had built. Each of them found that what they had built was sufficient. The record will be broken again. The current number, 4,111, is provisional in the way all records are provisional, which is to say, it is held only until someone comes along who has done the specific work required to exceed it. That person may already exist and may be in the middle of their preparation. They may not yet have found the record or felt the unnamed thing that precedes the decision to attempt it. They may be years away from being ready. But they are out there. The proof ensures this. The proof, which travels with the story, is landing right now in rooms where people are watching footage on their phones or their laptops, feeling the unnamed thing, starting to calculate. What that person will need, when they begin, is exactly what all of the others needed. Not a special gift, not a physical quality available only to a narrow category of person, just the decision, the private one, the one made at the specific moment when the signal arrives, the one that says, not yet. Everything downstream of that decision belongs to the person who makes it. The bar is there. It is always there.